Okay, welcome to part two, where we're going to address the loot box toaster UI to let the player know that they received a loot box in their inventory. So you don't have to open your inventory to see that you've got that. And as we do with most of our videos, we're going to look first at how Lyra is using their toaster, and then we'll design our own based on those learnings. So the elimination feed in the bottom left, when you kill another player, is an example of a toaster where UI elements pop up on screen for a small period of time, letting you know something has occurred, and then disappear. The way Lyra did it is in Shooter Core. Under the user interface notifications elimination feed, you'll find these four classes. That's pretty much the entirety of their system. The main widget is the elimination feed widget. That is kind of what is ever present on the screen, although quite frequently transparent. And then as you kill individual players or bots, the elimination feed entry widget, this little visual here you see with a name, the type of weapon that was used, and the person who was killed, manifest themselves on the left-hand side of the screen as a result of this data structure, which has all the relevant information which it needs, and this U object, which they're just using as a data transport layer. So that's the basic flow of how theirs works. And then this elimination feed, which I said lives on the HUD, mostly transparent, but as events occur, we'll add and remove these entry widgets. This elimination feed widget gets added in the shooter game standard HUD. And so you'll see that the shooter game standard HUD has the HUD layout in this first array element here. And then it has, I think, 10 or 11 widgets that it adds to the HUD. This first one being the elimination feed, and they add it to the HUD slot elimination feed. So the elimination feed widget, this W elimination feed, is added into this slot. When that elimination feed widget activates upon construct, it basically hides itself first and then sets up and listens for this kill feed. And so this Lyra add notification kill feed is triggered with a payload package of the data structure that we just looked at. So the data structure of this payload is what is created. It has the name, the attacking weapon, all the basic information, and then they create a widget every time they receive this message. They create the entry widget and then proceed to add it to the list. And inside that entry widget, a couple things are happening upon initialization of that. It immediately starts an animation. That animation starts off with opacity at 0 and then makes it visible, keeps it visible for about 4 or 5 seconds, and then makes it opacity 0 again on the tail end of that animation. So this animation is what you visually see happening on the screen. At the same time, they're running a timer. So this animation is 6 seconds long, and then this timer is 6 seconds long. So when the timer expires, this event gets triggered, and the toaster is removed. Now, this is an event dispatch. So what happens is, after 6 seconds, this event dispatch is fired, and then whoever is listening to this event dispatcher will get notified. And the way they designed it is on their parent widget back inside the elimination feed widget. They had bound themselves to this toaster expired, and then they basically remove the widget from the object list that's occurring. So there's an object list that's happening where you're adding more and more of these, so you can have multiple elimination messages on screen at a time, each one expiring after 6 seconds and then being removed from the list. So you have this sort of evergreen list of entries that are kind of floating up the side of the left-hand side of the screen. So we want to do something similar, but we don't need as much complexity. We don't need to have 6 or 7 loot boxes scrolling off to the side, given that we're only going to give a loot box at the end of a match. Um, if your game was to have multiple loot boxes, you may choose a model similar to this where you can have multiple things floating up the side. In fact, we may do that later. But for this example, because we're getting long in this video series, we're going to simplify this a little bit. We're going to use some of the same concepts, but we're not going to be as complex as this elimination. So the first thing we needed to do was figure out where on the screen we were going to pop up the loot box. Our first thought was to pop it up right over top of the elimination feeds, but that can get a little hairy where both are overlapping, and you might have one on top of the other. And then we looked at intermingling the two of them in one list. Also gets a little more complicated and probably overkill for what we need. So what we decided to do is on the right-hand side, we went ahead and added a new extension point. So if you look to the far right, we have our standard HUD slot equipment. That's where your weapons show up. Then we have our extra equipment. That's where your grenade shows up. And then we added a slot on top of that, calling it the loot box slot. And so our loot boxes will appear on screen as a toaster pop-up above the grenade on the right-hand side of the screen. So before we jump into the code, let's see it in action. In game, we'll start with the result, and then we'll go into the blueprint and C++ code to see how we dealt with the loot box pop-up. So I am in my front end map, and I have my editor set to not load the cosmetics, and we're going to do a full login so we have our persistent inventory. So we're going to get presented with our login window. We're going to log in so our character connects to our database. We're going to play a new match, and we're going to select our 3v3 mode. And then we'll just select a character. What we're looking for is the loot box pop-up at the end of a match. So we'll just take this character. All right, so the bots are set to not attack, which means they will be easy to kill once I find them all. All right, so what'll happen is in the bottom right hand, you'll see the elimination feed pop up as I eliminated the first enemy. Then I need to find another one. Oh, I just saw one over here. And another elimination in the bottom left-hand corner. And now when I eliminate the third one, we're going to see both the elimination pop up in the bottom left-hand corner, but we'll also see the reward loot box pop up in the right-hand corner right above the grenade. There you see the loot box pop up, indicating I got loot. And then if I were to go and open my inventory, you'll see loot boxes. So these are all the loot boxes from my prior tests. And then as I win a match, I get one more. So once again, sometimes just finding them is the hard part. they are on the stairs. All right. And then we'll get our loot box on the fifth. All right, so that's the result. Now let's go look at the blueprint and the C++ logic necessary to get that pop-up to appear in the bottom right. All right, so let's look at the classes that we ended up needing in order to make this work. Two of them we just copied from standard Lyra. The material instance was, you can just copy that off of the elimination feed, find the one of the pistol or whichever one you want, copy it over. We added a new texture to give us a visual for the loot box. We copied the layout, which we just before we showed you the match where we added our slot. And then we created this new widget, which is a very simple widget that brings the loot box into view, colors it the right team color, and then fades it away. All right, let's talk about some of the things you need in order to get that widget actually on the screen. So we start by creating the HUD layout. So add normally long. And using so this vertical box, the bottom right of the screen, we just added another extension point. So we copied the extra equipment, renamed it to the loot box extension point, and then I believe it's down here. You change the extension point tag. So this is the tag ID that is necessary in order to spawn a widget into this location. So with the HUD copied, we needed to change our HUD in-game. So to do that, we copied the shooter core standard HUD file, renamed that to our 3v3 standard HUD file, and then changed the layout here from shooter core HUD layout to 3v3 HUD layout. So we're using our HUD layout with the extra slot as opposed to the standard HUD layout. These were all copied over, and then we added one more widget, this 11th row, which is our loot box notification, and we put it in the loot box slot. So we have to change the layout that appears in the UI layer game tag under the layout settings, and then under the widget settings, we had to add this new one. So that action set then needs to be added to our experience. So then the experience for 3v3, we then changed the action set shooter core standard HUD to action set 3v3. And so that means that when this experience gets loaded, we will use this action set, which includes the HUD layout and includes the new widget. So at this point, we have an experience that loads a different HUD, that loads a widget, but doesn't do anything. So it's basically all the prerequisites are set and done. Now we need to make it actually function. So the first step in that was in scoring. And in scoring, we created this give loot box to team in the last video. And that give loot box to team got all the player controllers for a team, looped through each of them, checked that their team was the winning team, pulled their inventory component, and basically gave them the loot box in inventory, updated that in our database, And then we need this last step, which was to notify the client of the award. And so this last step, we'll look at that at the end, is what basically issues the gameplay message subsystem that the widget is listening for. So we'll come back and look at this in some C++ in a minute. But that issues the message. That message is picked up by this widget. So we just formatted the widget. Very simple. We just have some boxes. Then we just put the image and the glow. This started as a copy of the elimination feed and just deleted all the elements we didn't need, so that we followed the same general visual appeal, but made it ourselves. So we switched it from horizontal to vertical. Yeah, from horizontal to vertical. We increased the size of the loot icon to be much bigger. We put the name underneath it. And that's basically all there is in that element. And then in the event graph, we do our construct. We're listening not for the elimination feed, but for the loot feed. So we're listening for a different message, and we're listening for a different payload. So this is the loot message payload. As we're constructing, we then hide the widget so that we're not visible right out of the gate, and we sit and wait for this message to be received. When we get that message, we're going to grab the name and the team. We'll set the loot receiver name at the bottom of the screen to the name who received the loot, and then we'll set the color either red or blue based on whichever team they're on, and then finally show that notification. So the notification basically says, okay, when I want to show it, make it visible, run the animation, which we'll go look at in a second, and then set the timer. So this is exactly the way the elimination feed works, in that this animation runs for 6 seconds, this timer runs for 6 seconds, and then instead of a dispatch, because we don't have a list, we just have a single pop-up, instead of a dispatch, we're just going to hide the notification. So that's all this does, is hides the notification. We go back to the animation. All this animation is doing is it starts off with an opacity of 0. This brings the opacity up to 1, leaves it at 1 for a while, and then brings it back to 0. And so by creating that little animation where you get a little bit of transform offset on the X, that's what happens in the beginning. But most of it is this render opacity going in and out. So you'll see the transform come in on intro as it slides to the right. Then it waits for its 6 seconds of, and then slides out to the right. All right, so let's go look at the C++. All right, over in the C++ files, if you remember from our previous video, we created the loot inventory manager component. In that, we have created the struct. So this is the payload message that we use in the creation of the loot box pop-up. So we have a struct. Then in the main class, which we inherit from the Lyra inventory management component, we have 3 pieces that are used for the pop-up. Myself upside down. One is the one you just saw, the blueprint callable function, which notifies the client of the award. Then you have a bool that is being replicated with the onRep, and then the onRep function. So these 3 work together to get the information from the server to the client. And we'll cover this one in the 3rd video. We define our static tag. So this is the macro from Unreal that allows you to define a static tag. So we make sure that this tag is the payload tag that we want. We are replicating our triggering variable only to the owner. So this is a design choice. If we wanted all players to see the loot boxes that everyone got, we would replicate this to all players. But in our case, we only want the owning player to see the loot box pop up. So we're only replicating this to the owner, which is written like this, as opposed to this one commented out, which would tell everyone about the loot box. So we're only telling the owner. And let's go down to start here. So when we call this from our 3v3 scoring, we're going to do a quick check that we're still on the server, which should pass every time, but it's always good to have a quick check. Then we are just flipping this Boolean between true and false. We really don't care whether it's true or false. We just care that it changes. And then if our net mode happens to be listen server, which means I'm a client and a server, the replication will not replicate to myself. Therefore, in that scenario, I have to physically call the onRep function on the server in order for the client visuals to occur. So this can be a little tricky for some folks. When you do a rep notify of a variable on a dedicated server where no clients exist, you don't have to worry about this. When you do it on a listen server like Lyra is set up, by default, then if I'm the host player on the listen server, you need to add this one. This one will trip you up multiple times. All right, so by flipping this switch or by calling this directly, both result in the onRep loot box trigger being called on a client. So what will happen is the data will get transferred to the client. The client will then trigger this logic, and we'll pick the chain up here. So we basically get our player controller and then format our loot message. So we've defined our variable here. We have our two parameters or two properties inside that structure. One, we're going to get the player's name. The other, we're going to get their team. We could fail. If we do fail, we're just going to pass back no controller for debug purposes. Then we're going to formulate our broadcast message. So we get the message subsystem and broadcast the message on the tag with the loot message. And that is what gets picked up. This is the line that triggers the widget to wake up and create the visualization. So I think I covered all of it on the pop-up. Again, there's a couple of different design choices you could make. You could choose to replicate the loot message as opposed to the bool. So you might, if you wanted to have a more complicated loot box system, you might not just use a bool. You may choose to replicate a struct. And then every time the struct changed, you could process it on the client with all of its data. For our simplicity's sake, we're just going to replicate a bool. It's fast, it's easy. We only have one loot box. So that should give you both giving you the loot box in inventory from the scoring unit and then popping it up on the client screen to let me know. And in our third and final video, we will open the loot box and receive our rewards. Thanks for watching.